Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. My name is Stefano Marta, and I am the head of the Smart and Sustainable City Unit of the OECD. It's really my great pleasure to moderate this webinar today. So today, what we are going to do, we are going to launch the new OECD-SDSN policy paper on localizing the SDGs in a changing landscape, which builds on the findings of the joint survey that the OECD, SDSN, and the European Committee of Regions have conducted together last year. What the policy paper is highlighting is that despite the lack of progress on many SDGs targets, including on SDG 11, and the challenges that were caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the conflicts, the climate change, the SDGs are still on the top of the agenda for local and regional government. And I think this is really the great news that one of the great news that we can get from this joint work. And in particular, they responded to the survey, told us that 39% of local and regional government responding to our survey, they were using the SDGs before the pandemic, and they will keep using them even after the pandemic for the recovery. And what is even more interesting is that 25% told us that they did not use the SDGs before, but they are planning to do so for the recovery. The paper is also going to focus on three key policy areas that were particularly hit by the current crisis: the cost of living, energy, and food. Some housekeeping remarks before giving the floor to my colleagues for the opening. The event will be recorded and will be made available online to all the participants. For all the participants, you're really encouraged to interact with our panelists and with the speaker from OECD and the SDSN through the Q&A function. We'll make sure to have some time for the final discussion. In terms of agenda, we have a very exciting agenda because there will be the presentation of after the opening remarks, we are going to have the presentation of the key findings and the recommendation of the policy paper. And then we are going to have a panel with representatives from the Italian national government, from UN Habitat, from the SDSN Global Commission for SDG Urban Finance, and from the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Then we are going to have the Q&A session, and finally the concluding remarks from the Mayor of Braga and the Committee of Region Rapporteur on the SDGs. So without further ado, I will give the floor to my head of division, Aziz Akhmoush, Head of City, Urban Policy and Sustainable Development Division of the OECD, for the opening remarks. Aziz, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stefano, and welcome to I see 100 plus participants online at this stage. Mon cher Guillaume, dear Mayor Ricardo Rio, dear Mauricio and Chipra, we've been working together recently on a number of fronts. Dear Mara, Lucas, and all of you online. It's really a pleasure for me to kickstart the webinar today to launch this beautiful piece of work, joint piece of work between the OECD and SDSN on localizing the SDGs in a changing landscape, which is based, as Stefano mentioned, on a global survey that we conducted last year with the great support, as we've done for many of our surveys at the OECD, of the EU Committee of the Regions across more than 240 local and regional governments. And when we actually designed this piece of work with Guillaume and his team, we had two main objectives. The first one was to understand if and how the political commitment of local and regional governments vis-à-vis the SDGs had been affected by the latest and sometimes still ongoing crisis and shocks. And this relates, of course, to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the subsequent Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the crisis that related to the higher inflation and energy prices, a number of disruptions to global supply chains, and of course, adding to that, the heightened geopolitical tensions. The second objective was to draw attention on those specific SDGs where progress was either stalling or deemed insufficient, which includes, as Stefano just pitched in his intro remarks, many of the determinants of what we call the cost of living. At least this was the case for an overwhelming majority of respondents, over 83% of respondents, for what regards energy, housing, and food, but also a number of targets that relate more to poverty, hunger, and climate. And this is an important point because as we've moved past somehow the midpoint towards 2030, we see that we are still facing significant delays in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, that only 15% are actually considered to be on track for achievement globally. Of course, they're huge, and I work in the place at the OECD that is about territorial development. There are huge differences across countries and within countries, and we have to go beyond this global average, but 15%, that's the global stock take for the time being. About 48% of the targets are currently insufficient vis-a-vis the end value that is targeted, and over a third, 37%, are either stagnating or regressing. And you'll hear in a moment the deep dive findings of the report from my colleagues Laurence and Imon, but let me share, and I'll conclude my remarks with these two main reasons why I personally find this piece of work fascinating and important these days. The first one is that it's once more, I think, a great illustration of the extent to which long-term, stable, visionary policy frameworks are constantly disrupted by a myriad of daily, unforeseen, and systemic crises, which often provide the ground for inaction, if not procrastination. You may have heard in one of the songs of John Lennon that life is what happens while you are busy making other plans. We are all welcoming this long-term forward-looking vision, 15 years in this case for the SDGs, but the reality is that every day, and we work with governments at the OECD, a government can find a very good excuse for not acting or not acting sufficiently fast on what is considered to be a long-term priority, because there's no money, because there's no citizen support, because the benefits are too long-term, because there's a disruption or a discontinuity in the electoral cycle, and I could go on with the list. And this is where I think we have to change the narrative and recall not only that all the policy goals that are captured by the 2030 agenda are today's problem, not 2030's problem. We see that climate is having devastating impacts today. We see that water is too scarce or plentiful in places today. We see that housing is a hot potato almost everywhere today. And therefore, there's no room for the complacency trap, even in contexts of crisis. And the second thing that I think can help with this narrative is that there are tangible co-benefits for acting now. And this is what we're doing at the OECD, showing that these SDGs are so interconnected that they have to be seen as a package whereby achievements made in one specific area holds benefits for another area. We're just out of a global ministerial meeting. You may have seen that France hosted on the topic of decarbonizing buildings. And it's amazing to see how this constituency has managed to document these co-benefits. That in the US, for example, for every €1 million you invest in decarbonizing your buildings, you're creating 30 jobs. That in the European Union, you're saving through the Renovate projects and funding 190 billions of euros of health expenditure that you would otherwise have to cost if this has not been fixed, and so on. So I think this co-benefit conversation is really something that needs to be put on the radar of the politicians. And the second reason why I find this piece fascinating is that it is illustrating once more, and that's my final point, why local and regional governments need to step in even more strongly when and where national governments are sometimes stepping back. I think as the OECD and with Stefano and the team, we have long been arguing that local and regional governments do not need to look at the SDGs as a sort of compliance framework, because this is a compliance framework for the national governments that have to go to the UN and report on where they stand and have to be held accountable for making progress. But it's a policy-making tool. It's one that helps you define your policy priorities, that helps you manage your trade-offs, that helps you put the constituencies around the table, allocate budget, prioritize investments. And what we see on a daily basis is that mayors and governors are very pragmatic. They know much better their place-based specifics than capitals. We see that every day in the work we're doing within the Champion Mayors Initiative for Inclusive Growth. And even if they don't wake up in the morning, and I used this sentence a while ago, saying that their top priority is to implement the 2030 agenda, they wake up in the morning saying they have to fix very practical problems, you know, housing affordability and transport accessibility and air quality and land use and so on. And all these are issues that are underpinning each of the 169 targets behind the goal. So I think this is a very nice wake-up call, you know, to remind us of this double goal, you know, of making sure that local and regional governments also do their shares, but also explaining the sense of urgency to national governments in the face of many distractions that are all legitimate. So we should keep pushing, get back on track, use the crisis as a means to faster, if I say, or go faster in terms of action rather than delaying action or postponing emergencies. And my final word is to thank the team that has worked hand in hand to produce this beautiful piece, and the trustworthy and stimulating partnership with SDSN and the Committee of Regions, and to all the panelists in advance for sharing their wisdom. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Aziza, for this great introductory remarks. Now let's give the floor to the other partner of this policy paper, SDSN, and in particular to Guillaume Lafortune, who is the Vice President and the head of the Paris office. So Guillaume, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Stefano, and maybe I'll pick up from where Aziza ended, and just to share our major thank you to the OECD, of course, and to the Committee of the Region for this wonderful partnership and collaboration. Also, as Aziza mentioned, to the more than 240 respondents to the survey tool, city and regional leaders from both OECD and non-OECD member states, to the team, of course, and in particular to you, Stefano, Lawrence, and Eamon Drum as well, and indeed to all the distinguished panelists that are joining us today and the participants. I'll be quite brief because I think the team will share the detailed results in a second, but in my mind, there's probably at least three major points that this report is emphasizing. First of all, I think the report is very clear about the importance of the principle of subsidiarity in order to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And by subsidiarity, I mean being able to take decisions and mobilize resources at the right territorial level where the impact must actually happen. There are issues that must be tackled at the global level, at the regional level or continental level. Of course, nation states still handle a lot of the policy and financing needed to achieve those goals, but many of them actually require a strong involvement from some national entities. So, of course, at the global level, there's a Summit of the Future at the UN, which will take place in September. Hopefully, we can move forward when it comes to addressing those global issues that require global governance mechanisms and possibly also global financing mechanisms. But of course, the report mentions it very clearly. 105 out of 169 targets require action and involvement of the subnational level. And Aziza said it very well, whether it's for transport, land use, housing, and many, many other SDGs, subnational entities are absolutely critical. The second point, and this is related to the first point, is I think the report is quite clear on one of the barrier faced by a number of local and regional entities to implement the SDGs, which is related to financing. I think some the cities and regions face very specific issues around financing in the broader context where there's global discussions around the reform of the global financial architectures. The challenges here are quite specific, and I believe in the survey that was run, financing comes out as the #1 challenge faced by cities and regions. And I think that the specificity, of course, is that some cities cannot generate deficit. Most of them are dependent on cash transfers from the central authorities, and none of them, at least not to the level of a nation states, can actually access financing from multilateral development banks that are specialized in urban projects. So there's some specificities that I think are worth highlighting. And this is also a good opportunity to mention the work that we are doing also in collaboration with the OECD, this SDSN Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance, which is preparing its recommendation to address this issue of financing. This is co-chaired by Prof. Jeff Sachs, Mayor Hidalgo from Paris, and Mayor Page. And I think it's wonderful that we have Mauricio Rodas with us today, who will say more about the very important work conducted by this commission. And to conclude, and maybe like my last point, because I wanted to end also on a note of optimism and hope. I think what the report shows actually is that there is still quite high levels of political traction around those sustainable development goals, despite the crises, the tensions. We see that all over the world, and in particular in cities and regions, there is a lot of momentum still around those sustainable development goals. Of course, 188 UN member states submitted a voluntary national review since the adoption of the SDGs. More than 170 VLRs have been published. The survey results, I think, shows that less than 25% say that they don't use the SDGs at all in terms of respondents. And we saw it also in the G20 communique of India last September, that the SDGs were also at the center of some of those discussions. And of course, at SDSN, we've worked closely with a number of governments that have actually developed financing tools around the SDGs, like SDG bonds, for instance. So I think in this difficult context, I think it's a good sign to see that there is still focus, as Aziza was mentioning, around long-term sustainable development, and we should keep this momentum going in this important years and in the years to come. So I think I'll stop here, but again, thank you so much to the OECD, the Committee of the Region, and the team, and I very much look forward to the rest of the discussion today.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you so much. Brilliant introduction. Now let's move to the two actual authors of the policy paper to present a bit more in depth the findings, the possible OECD SDSN recommendation and way forward. So I'm happy to give the floor to my colleague Lawrence Gross, policy analyst at the OECD, and Eamon Drum from Senior Program Officer in SDSN to present the policy paper. So Lawrence, Eamon, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Stefano. So indeed, yes, we're very pleased to now be able to finally present the findings and also the suggested ways forward of this paper on localizing the SDGs in a changing landscape. As already mentioned before in introduction, this is a paper drafted together with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, building on a survey that we run together with SDSN and also the Committee of the Regions. It's actually already the third survey we conducted with the Committee of the Regions after 2019 and 2021. And Stefano and Aziza and Guillaume, they have already mentioned a bit what this paper really was about, to take stock of the progress made by cities and regions in implementing the SDGs, to look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to look at how current crises such as the war in Ukraine are affecting the work on the SDGs, in particular in the areas of energy, food, and the cost of living crisis. And we have had over 240 responses overall to our survey, most of them from EU countries, but also from other OECD countries and non-OECD countries, including municipalities, regions, but also more than 60 responses from other participants, which we grouped as territorial stakeholders, which include academia, businesses, and associations. And looking a bit at the distribution, we mostly had responses from Poland, Italy, and Germany, followed by Spain and Portugal. And I'll leave it with this introduction and now hand over to Eamon for the first kind of section of the paper on a snapshot on the SDGs localization. Thank you.
Thanks, Lawrence. And thank you again to Aziza, Stefano, and Guillaume for the introduction. We'll start with the general and then move towards the more specific in terms of the findings and the recommendations. To begin with, in terms of general strategies that were used to, or the most common actions to localize the SDGs among survey respondents, Awareness-raising campaigns were the most common. Almost 2/3, so 60% of responding local and regional governments stated that they used awareness-raising campaigns to take action on the SDGs locally. This was followed by implementing a dedicated strategy or action plan at 56%. With regards to awareness-raising campaigns, this was already the top finding, or rather the top action that was taken by respondents in the 2021 OECD Committee of the Regions survey. So there's some continuity in time. Getting further down the list, in the most recent survey, more than half of the respondents also reported using existing indicators or setting up new measurement systems to track progress on the SDGs. And slightly less common were dedicated governance agreements, like setting up an internal committee or task force that was working horizontally across departments. That's about 34% of respondents, or a sustainable development council linked directly to a higher level decision maker, and that was only found amongst 16% of the respondents in local and regional governments. I'll stop there and pass it back to, actually, I'm next as well, sorry. So looking at the success factors, we asked what were the key success factors for the localization or the implementation of the SDGs locally. Among the local and regional governments, political leadership at the local level was by far the top success factor. That was indicated by 76% of LRGs as being the leading factor for successful SDG localization. But close behind that were peer-to-peer learning with other cities and regions at 57%. This shows the importance of learning from each other, of course, but also the key role of EU bodies and UN institutions or other international organizations in facilitating this. Having a dedicated budget or funding line was indicated as a key success factor for slightly more than 50% of LRG surveyed. We also, and this is not shown in the figure, but we also asked about challenges that local and regional governments faced in localizing SDGs. And as Guillaume alluded to in his introduction, a lack of financing was the top challenge at 64% of respondents saying that was their key difficulty. But there was also mention of shifting political priorities, lack of vertical coordination, and a lack of awareness among stakeholders within 40% of respondents saying that those were also challenges that they faced in implementation. I'll pass it back to Lawrence for the next section.
Thank you very much, Eamon. So I'll talk a bit about the second section of our survey. To the next slide, please, which was about using the SDGs in the COVID-19 recovery phase. And we actually asked local and regional governments, are you using the SDGs as a framework for your recovery? And it was already mentioned by Stefano. Quite an optimistic finding. We saw that 39% of local and regional governments had used the SDGs before the pandemic and also used them to address the recovery phase. We had 25% of local and regional governments that did not use them before, but stated that they were planning to use them now. And then an additional 9% had not used them before, but started to use them to address the recovery, which is also quite an optimistic finding. We see that actually the pandemic was a kind of a driver for the uptake of the SDGs in different local and regional governments. Another area we looked at was looking at post-COVID-19 challenges in cities and regions. And here we got a pretty clear response, which was that the people dimension, so the SDGs 1 till 5, were the most reported challenge, named by 45% of respondents, followed by the people dimension, which was mentioned by the planet dimension, which was mentioned by 22%. So really see people and the environment as the most affected regions. And then I'll start with a third section. Another slide further, please. Great, thanks a lot. So as mentioned before, one of the areas we have looked at in particular was the impact of the increase in cost of living. So one question there that we asked was, what was the impact of the cost of living crisis on the standards of living in your city, in your region? And that was already mentioned before that more than 80% actually mentioned that the living standards had decreased already as a result of the cost of living crisis. There was a certain share of almost 30% who even expected further deterioration. So really see the impact of the cost of living crisis on the standards of living. And also, this is quite in line with what we had asked about the COVID-19 impact. We asked about the impact of the increase in cost of living in cities and regions. And here as well, poverty with 70% of respondents, energy with 70% of respondents, and housing with 58% of respondents were those three areas that cities and regions consider to be the most affected. But of course, we also wanted to look a bit at the more forward going measures and response measures, what cities actually did in this situation of increasing price levels. And most of the local and regional governments that we surveyed answered that they implemented support measures for vulnerable populations. That was the case for more than 2/3 of the respondents. And then in addition to these support measures, there were also some measures put in place to actually cut costs. So there was a reduction in the average temperature public buildings for more than 60% of respondents, and also reductions of street lighting overall for 46% of respondents. And actually this energy-related topic brings me to the next section that Eamon will present on the specific impacts on SDG 7.
Thanks, Lawrence. Yeah, so we obviously the question of energy use is inextricably linked to cost of living, but we decided to ask specific questions about it given the geopolitical context. And one of the main results was that SDG 7, so ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, has become more relevant for 75% of local and regional governments since the outbreak of the Russian war in Ukraine. As also, among other findings, electricity prices, so the impacts are being felt in local and regional governments, particularly in some areas rather over others. The 23% of surveyed local and regional governments reported that SDG 7 had become a top priority for them locally, and a further 57% said that it had increased in relevance. Only 18% of LRGs had said that it had become or had remained as relevant as before, and just 3% indicated that it had become less relevant. So clearly the question of energy is one of the main priorities of local and regional governments, and has been deeply impacted by the changing geopolitical context. The impact of the war in Ukraine was on LRG's ability to attain SDG 7 was particularly stark with regards to electricity costs. So the direct impact on citizens, on local businesses. These have increased. Local electricity costs have increased for over 70% of within 70% of LRGs since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. Half of local and regional governments responded that the costs had increased by up to 50% since the beginning of the war. An additional 21% said that it had increased by between 50 and 100%. And for 16% of local and regional governments, electricity costs had increased by over 100%. So the impact is quite stark. By way of comparison, just taking a deeper dive into the EU, respondents from within the EU. There's a sample of 145 respondents. The impact in the EU was even greater. So 94% of local and regional governments in the EU reported that electricity costs had increased. Over 50% said that they'd increased by more than 50%, by up to 50%. Nearly a quarter said that it was between 50 and 100%, and almost 20%, so a much greater percentage than the overall respondents, stated that electricity costs had gone up by over 100%. So the impact was quite noticeable and quite important for those local and regional governments. I will pass it back to Lawrence for the next slide.
Yes. Thanks. So this will be the concluding slide for the findings, and then we'll move on with the recommendations or the ways forward. So the last area that we looked at was food security, in particular SDG 2 on zero hunger. And here we also saw that it has gained importance overall for more than 30% of local and regional governments as a result of the inflation that they were facing. But at the same time, it didn't have the same relevance as energy, for example, because we saw that more than 50% did not see it as a main priority, or stated to have also other pressing issues. But still, there were a lot of measures taken to address SDG 2 and to address food security. For example, to set up local food banks and food disruption programs to respond to those ruptures in food supply chains. And then we also asked cities and regions about the measures that they have put in place to achieve sustainable food systems and to reduce food waste. So the responses to achieve a sustainable food system, you can see on the slide and in the graph on the left side. So in particular, the promotion of local and regional food production and the promotion of a circular economy approach to the food system were mentioned. And this circular economy approach was also mentioned as one of the main strategies to reduce food waste alongside using surplus food and the prevention of food waste in general throughout the supply chain. And now, as already indicated, we'll start with a little overview of the policy implications and ways forward, which will start with intervention by Eamon, and then we'll get back into the three main policy areas afterwards.
Thanks again, Lawrence. So just by way of overview, we, based on the findings of the paper, we suggested a range of ways forward, beginning with some more general recommendations about SDG localization, given the current context. First, the paper suggests the need to continue to develop and execute post-COVID recovery plans to allow for alignment with the SDGs. It also recommends taking advantage of SDG data and localized indicator frameworks to assess the ongoing impact of the pandemic at the local level, and the need to promote policy coherence across levels of government. There's also an opportunity here to, at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, but given the ongoing recovery from the pandemic and its impacts, to reassess multi-level governance. So for SDG implementation in cities, regions, and national governments, to work better across these levels of government in order to reduce the risk of a disjointed recovery. To boost the implementation of the SDGs, we need to leverage political leadership, so the growing and important political leadership at the local level. This could be an important way of leveraging the continuing importance of the 2030 agenda at other levels of government. And then, of course, in and among national and international city networks. So it's an opportunity to continue to deepen and increase peer-to-peer learning on the 2030 agenda. Excuse me. This could be used to increase uptake of the SDG or of policy tools and monitoring frameworks, but also to raise awareness amongst internal and external stakeholders. And finally, addressing the financial resources, so funding capacity. In the current context, given the continued pandemic recovery, but also the geopolitical situation, local and regional governments should use the SDGs as a tool to allocate budgets to ensure that funding and financing is sufficient. LRGs can use the SDGs to attract investment, whether through innovative financial mechanisms like municipal or regional sustainability bonds, local investment crowdfunding platforms, or contingency funds that are tied to achieving specific SDGs. Local and regional governments can also encourage private sector investment to fund urban development in alignment with the SDGs through sustainable public procurement and PPPs. And finally, local and regional governments can participate in or learn from the growing number of networks that are focused specifically on this question of financing. So I, of course, will point to the SDSN Global Commission on Urban SDG Finance as one of these. But there are an increasing number of instances that are working specifically on this question of using the SDGs to increase the capacity of local and regional governments to finance recovery projects. And with that, I will turn it back to Lawrence.
Yes, thank you very much. So now going a bit more into the three policy areas that we have already discussed in the findings. The first one on cost of living. So our main recommendation, our main way forward there was to combat the increasing price levels. And there are a couple of different measures that we have suggested. The first one is more of an educational one, which is to provide a local population with resources and education on budgeting and financial management, especially during these times of economic stress. Then, of course, we saw that housing is a big issue. So to improve housing affordability by developing targeted solutions for the most vulnerable population is very important. For example, temporary rent subsidies or eviction preventions that can help. And then also to expand social safety nets and food assistance programs. So this already goes a bit into the food area as well. And as we've seen, that fuel has become very expensive as a result of the increasing inflation, especially fuel was impacted, and electricity. It was important to enhance the public transportation option as an alternative to the usage of individual cars. And then we go back to energy for Eamon.
Thanks. So the findings of the survey with regards to SDG 7 suggests that given the increasing importance of access to clean, affordable energy for all, for local and regional governments, that efforts to respond to this should focus on decarbonization, but also both in production and the consumption sides for residents and city stakeholders. On the production side, this could involve using public procurement to better negotiate with energy providers for greener power mix, but also creating the enabling conditions for local energy generation, so district heating systems, rooftop solar, and other measures. On the consumption side, local and regional governments can and should offer technical support. So, for example, public energy efficiency consultancy for residents and businesses, as well as financial support, whether through grants or soft loans in partnership with local banks. They should provide these to local businesses and citizens in order to enable building energy retrofits. Also, continued awareness-raising campaigns, of course, are important, but partnerships with local nonprofits and other organizations can be a way to better leverage the renewed attention on SDG 7. And also, streamlining permitting processes for greener building projects is a way to help enable the energy decarbonization on the consumption side. And finally, one major area of leverage that Aziza alluded to in her introduction, but that's important to reemphasize, is that local and regional governments can also lead by example by decarbonizing government-owned municipal buildings and assets. So this includes retrofitting their own building stock, but also infrastructure like street lighting, the electrification of the transportation fleets, setting more ambitious standards for renovation projects that impacts their own building stock. And finally, adopting financial models that are better aligned with decarbonization, so green bonds, among others. These are some of the policy implications and recommendations that you'll find in the paper.
Excellent. So then I'll conclude with the last policy area. So we're back to food. And the two main recommendations that we had that also align with the findings of our paper is the promotion of sustainable food systems, for example, through the support of local and regional food production, also seeing food systems as really part of urban development, so not seeing it as a separate item. So that means integrating urban food strategies into urban development strategies to really connect the social, economic, and environmental aspects of food systems. And then again, here as well, the systematic knowledge sharing of cities' action and best practices can help. Just in the last roundtable that we organized last May, we had a dedicated session where, for example, the city of Milan shared some of their good practices on this topic. And then lastly, the reduction of food waste, which of course is also a very important aspect. And here, encouraging a circular economy approach and developing comprehensive circular economy strategies in cities and regions can be a major step to reduce food waste. Also, the support and collaboration with organizations that rescue surplus food and distribute it to those in need. Also, for example, technology-based applications that collect surplus food can be a measure here. And then again, in the end, it's a lot about the citizens also. So we could support citizens with public awareness campaigns to educate them, and also the private sector, about the environmental and economic impact that food waste has, and therefore really increase the awareness of what they can do. So the actions start at a very granular local level in that case. And yeah, so that marks the conclusion of the findings. And now I'm happy to hand back over to Stefano to start with our very interesting panel discussion that is ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lawrence. Thank you, Eamon, for the presentation and for the great work in developing and drafting this policy paper. There will be time for discussion after the panel, so I really encourage all the participants to ask questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I see that the chat is already quite active. Now let's go to the panel, and the objective of the panel is really to go a little bit more in depth into some of these findings, like the issue of financing, capacity building, political leadership, or even into the three policy areas that we just described. So let me start with Mara Cossu, the first panelist. Mara is from the Italian government. In particular, she's Sustainable Development Strategy Coordinator at the Italian Ministry of Environment and Energy Security. We have been working already quite a lot with Mara and her team on providing in the framework of the Italian National Strategy for Sustainable Development, both in terms of policy coherence and localizing the SDGs. So for you, Mara, the first question is, it would be great if you can tell us a little bit more what Italian regions and cities are doing in the localization of the SDGs in this post-COVID and current geopolitical context, and also how the ministry is working with Italian cities and regions on that. You have 3 minutes. I really ask all the panelists to stick to the 3 minutes so we can keep a bit of time for a final discussion with all the participants. Mara, you have the floor, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks to you, Stefano, and thanks for this space of discussion and for the findings from the report, which are quite useful also for the work we are doing with our territories. Just some key elements from our experience. We are working with our regions and metropolitan cities since 2019 because we have a law requirement which is asking for the definition of regional strategies for sustainable development and for the regions to coordinate the engagement of local entities. And it also calls for regions to align to the National Strategy for Sustainable Development. So basing on this mandate, basically from 2019, and so we worked fully within the pandemic environment, we developed a sort of system and multi-level system for sustainable development strategies and objectives in Italy, which means that through agreements with each of our regions and our autonomous provinces and our metropolitan cities, we provided support for the definition of the regional strategies and the local agendas for sustainable development. And we also provided working groups for technical collaboration. So which means that based on the opening from the director wanting to put policy making as one of the main working issue for implementing the 2030 agenda, we tried to create a collaborative environment to bring peace through policy coherence for sustainable development and through 2030 agenda to bring at the core of the regional and territorial policy making the SDGs, which means that now we can count on 18 out of 21 regional strategies approved and 9 out of 14 metropolitan agendas approved, which is not a result per se, but it indicates that we have worked a lot on some enabling conditions which mirror into one of main findings that you have in the report, and the main findings coming from the opening of this session. The first one is about internal governance, which means we have now territorial steering committees to govern the complexity of the implementation of the 2030 agenda in each of our region and in each of our metropolitan city. Which means that we have an internal collaborative environment gathering different departments and discussing about the alignment and contribution of different policies to the achievement of the SDGs and the national objectives for sustainable development. This is based on the implementation of the program that Italy has adopted on policy coherence for sustainable development in 2023, drafted through the OECD collaboration in 2022. It is now, and it opened and paved the way towards some basic elements that I want to raise now to your attention just for a minute. The first one is about one of the main findings you have about budgeting, which means that many regions and many metropolitan cities have aligned the budget to the SDGs and to the national objectives, and they're working on that. The second one is about the integration of sustainable development objectives through and into the national recovery and resilience plan and its implementation at territorial level, as well as into cohesion policies. We are developing models and assessment plans to understand if and how this huge amount of funding is helping in achieving the SDGs, if and how, and what we have to reorient in case it's not. The last piece of work we have developed is about narrative. Again, taking that from the director's opening, we have to invert the narrative and to demonstrate how much we are working about the achievement of the SDGs. So we worked about a multi-level indicators framework in Italy, which means having shared measures to assess if and how we are going towards the direction we track. with the SDGs implementation. And we have worked in 2022 on an integrated reporting and an integrated voluntary national review with 12 voluntary local reviews are next, and a voluntary subnational review are next as well. And it also opens the way to the new season of agreements we are signing this year with all the regions, metropolitan cities and autonomous provinces to continue working on the enabling condition we find out, the policy coherence for sustainable development, the culture for sustainability. So education and training are still key elements in our experience, and for the engagement of stakeholders and right holders, and put peer learning exchanges and horizontal governance mechanism at the core of the exercise. I thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Amara. Indeed, a great example how multi-level governance can be a tool to strengthen the localization of the SDGs. We'll hear a bit more also in the second round of the panel. And now I'm really glad to give the floor to Shipra Narayan-Suri. She is the Chief Urban Policy Branch at UN Habitat. UN Habitat is a key institution for the localization of the SDGs, and in particular, Shipra is a key person in the UN system. So thanks for joining us, Shipra. And can you tell us, based on the experience, the work of UN Habitat, and also in the work of the Local 2030, in your view, how voluntary local reviews can play a role in this post-COVID pandemic context and this geopolitical complex context? So what could be really the role of this VLR that were mentioned also by Italy and by Guillaume? You have the floor, Shipra.
Thanks, Stefano, and thanks very much, colleagues. Aziza, great to see you. Also, Mara and Maurizio and many others. And congratulations to you, to OECD and SDSN on this report. For me, just to recap a couple of quick things. One, you already said, COVID-19 was a turning point, but it was a turning point for many reasons. But one, that it catapulted local and regional governments to the front line of the discussion in a very big way. They were at the front lines of keeping the population safe, ensuring the basic services flowing, preventing an economic collapse, shaping the recovery, building resilience, and none of how the pandemic was contained and recovery was planned could have happened without local and regional governments. When we talk about conflicts and not just Ukraine, but everything else that we're seeing, again, cities are the locus of conflict. They are both, either they are facing complete or partial destruction, as we're seeing, or they are the place where people are seeking refuge. So again, local and regional governments are under great pressure to either, launch reconstruction, build resilience, or provide infrastructure, services, and host very large numbers of people. And at the same time, we're facing what we call at the UN the triple planetary crisis. And you have highlighted a prolonged period of economic stress, Lawrence, you said, the rising poverty, hunger, etc. Now, in this context of a multiple and intersecting and expanding crises, there is no playbook. There was no playbook, there was no manual, there was no pre-existing best practice. Voluntary local reviews emerged as a process by cities and for cities to organize themselves and their actions around the SDGs. And since 2016, we've had 300 plus VLRs. Specifically, four things that the VLRs achieved. One, they created an unprecedented push for the development of data at the subnational and local level. Our OECD works so much on data. Stefano, you and us, we collaborate on many things. But through the VLRs, local and regional governments worldwide have started reviewing and strengthening their data and linking it to policy making and planning for the SDGs. And this is quite unique in these circumstances. Second, VLRs are not just, they are a tool that have become quite important in reinforcing accountability and transparency and building a new social contract. The processes of inclusion and participation that we have advocated for in the VLRs have helped to create policies that are responsive to the needs of people, but also a rebuilding of trust in public institutions, which is the one thing that is if there was one crisis that's underpinning everything else, it is the mistrust, it's the lack of trust in public institutions and in governments at this point. The third is the point that Mara was just making, that the VLR processes have also led to an increased conversation between national and local. A discussion between the VNR and the VLR has also led to a reopening of the discussion on devolution, on decentralization, on multi-level governance, on multi-level dialogue and coordination, horizontal coordination, vertical cooperation, and policy coherence in a very big way. And finally, the VLR movement has opened up new opportunities for cities to engage in the global arena. You mentioned in your report that peer-to-peer support was one of the top findings, that they felt was an important factor, an important success factor in the localization efforts. And the VLR process, it's become a common language to engage in that peer-to-peer support that we are seeing. I just want to say at the end of this intervention that, the work of local governments and communities on VLRs and through VLRs and voluntary subnational reviews, the VSRs, has been a game changer for the SDGs. And this has been recognized at the highest level within and outside the UN. And that's why the Local 2030 Coalition, which brings together the entire UN system on this, is gaining so much traction. UN Habitat has just launched an action-oriented VLR methodology. I'm happy to post a link in the chat when I finish. But through this new methodology and through our SDG series flagship initiative, we aim that VLRs become a key SDG-oriented instrument for local governments to plan and deliver development for their communities, rather than a compliance framework, as Aziza mentioned, and also going beyond an advocacy process. Really, they should become the means and the instrument and the tool to galvanize planning and galvanize investments for an impact orientation, which is defined by the SDGs. I'll leave it there, and then I'll come back for a second round if we have time. Thanks, Stefano.
Yes, perfect. Perfect, Shivra. Thank you very much. There will be time for sure for a second round. And also you can definitely post the UN Habitat handbook on VLR in the chat. Now let's move to another panelist. And as we mentioned during the presentation and during the introduction, financing is really one of the major issues, if not the measure, that local and regional governments are experiencing in localizing the SDGs. So we are really glad to have Mauricio Rodas, who is from the SDSN Global Commission on SDG Urban Finance, and also from the University of Pennsylvania. So Mauricio has mentioned, can you give us a bit more information about which are the key findings and some of the preliminary recommendations of the SDSN Commission on financing the SDGs in city?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much, Stefano and the OECD and SDSN for this invitation. I'm delighted to share this panel with so many friends and great experts on this particular field. The first thing I would like to mention is that, well, we have seen how the issue of finance is the #1 challenge identified in the survey, and with big reasons for that. First of all, we need to say that cities are confronting an international financial system that was designed for countries. It was designed under Bretton Woods in the 1940s, where the world was not nearly as urbanized as it is today. Well, things have changed, but unfortunately, the global financial architecture has not. And it is not fit for purpose anymore to cover the huge needs of a world in which cities are at the forefront of dealing with some of the world's most pressing issues. For example, it is estimated that cities will need between $4.5 and $5.4 trillion per year until 2030 to turn their infrastructure into a climate resilient one. There's no way in which cities can access those resources, such a huge amount of resources, under the current rules of the game of the international financial system. Let's say that, for example, only 44% of countries in the world allow local borrowing. So that means in the other 56% of countries, it is forbidden for cities to access international borrowing. That's a big problem. Also, when we look at the way cities are trying to access international borrowing when they can do that legally, they confront a MDB system that is also country-focused. MDBs are allocating money through national governments for those national governments to disperse it internally. And they very often do so under political criteria, not necessarily a technical one. Why? At the end of the day, we need to realize that MDBs are governed by national governments. So they follow that country logic that it is influencing the whole system. And that's what we need to change. And that's the work of the SDSN Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance, to explore reforms to the international financial system to make it more cities friendly. And one of the specific outcomes in which we are working is that of the creation of a Green Cities Guarantees Fund. Why? Because the lack of access of cities to guarantees is preventing them to accessing finance. As I mentioned, only in 44% of countries in the world, cities are allowed to borrow. But in most cases, in those countries, cities need a national government's guarantee, a national sovereign guarantee that very frequently is not granted because of political rivalries between the national and the local government. So we have that kind of challenge in addition to other challenges associated with lending criteria for cities. So for example, they often confront high interest rates, short tenor, long and complex approval process, and unfortunately, in many cases, credit denial. So I think that coming up with a new city-focused guarantees facility that would ensure affordable and timely borrowing for cities could be a big game changer for improving cities' access to finance. And we think that that's a very feasible goal to achieve in the short term. This will become, as I said, a guarantees fund targeting specific needs from cities, specializing in urban projects and adjusting those guarantees, for example, to municipal political timeframes, which are different than those of national governments. Those are the kind of specific criteria that this guarantees fund will address. And another very important project in which the Commission is working that would be a big step in changing this country-focused international financial system is exploring the idea of setting up a Green Cities Development Bank, like a World Bank for cities. Why not? I think that that would become an institution that would channel financial resources directly into cities as to overcome some of the current challenges cities now are confronting because of dealing, again, with an international financial system that is country-focused. This institution can also support cities to develop the creditworthiness levels, which is also a big barrier for many cities, particularly medium-sized and small cities in developing countries, to access finance and to support those cities as well in project preparation. Because unfortunately, even if funding is available, which is unfortunately not the case many times, but even if it is, many cities confront the problem of developing technically sound, bankable projects to access those financial opportunities. And we are sure that the setting up of this new institutional arrangement could help solving that problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mauricio, also for giving us some numbers and some very concrete recommendations. It will be interesting to know also what the participant and maybe also the other panelists think about these ideas. Let's now move to the last panelist of this round. We are very happy to have Lucas Padilla. He's the head of international affairs and cooperation from the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Lucas, thank you very much for joining us. And can you explain us a bit more what Rio de Janeiro, so finally we can have the perspective of the city, of a specific city, is doing on the localization of the 2030 agenda in this complex period, and also what is the role of the Brazilian G20 presidency for supporting the localization of the SDGs. Lucas, you have the floor, and 3 minutes, please.
Stefano, Mauricio, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. From Rio, what we have are great expectations. The G20 is a forum with finance in its DNA, and it's the forum, a multilateral forum that is not yet a multi-level forum, meaning that cities can play a role as part of one engagement group. So Rio and São Paulo are co-chairing the Urban 20. This engagement group is very relevant. It can make recommendations to national leaders, and those national leaders that will be convening in Rio for the G20 summit in November, they will be facing a year-long discussion about MDB reform, how to better fund and finance climate transition, resiliency, and development. The discussions around the Summit of the Future at the UN and the discussions around the spring summit meetings of the IMF and World Bank, for example, are very relevant to the G20. This group encompasses 80% of world GDP, and Brazil is part of that. It's presiding over this very relevant group. What Rio can do? Rio is a city, so we are an actor, and we are also the stage. When you are a very good stage for national politics, you can ask something out of your national government. This is a very unique conjunction of factors, and Mayor Paes, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, he has been supporting the national government throughout the whole G20 process. We will have 38 events in Rio, including the financial ministerial meeting, meaning that we can use this year-long agenda to influence Sherpa track, finance track, and leaders to join us in an agenda that encompasses what Mauricio and OECD are discussing, SDSN is discussing. How do we better fund SDGs? Fund and finance SDGs. Cities, they are the first and the last one to implement policies, right? We can't ask from local governments within countries like Brazil or countries from the global south to completely contract all targets and fund them by themselves. But we are not asking for aid and technical support only. We are asking for private and public funds that can be profitable to fund better projects and public policy. So in Rio, we have this our Urban Sustainable Development Plan, our SDG targets. They are very all-encompassing. We have 4 main pillars, and we are using all 17 SDGs. We are reporting it on an yearly basis, and very interestingly, we have 900 very specific targets. And these targets, if they are met, civil servants will get a bonus in their annual income, meaning that we want to incentivize people to go beyond their daily activities in order to achieve SDGs. And how to do that? You have to look at education, for example, from the perspective of the youth, from the climate perspective, from the perspective of how you educate people to live in a resilient city. How do you better prepare your city for a world that won't match the Paris Agreement, probably? If we don't match
I think there is a technical problem with Lucas while the team tried to fix the issue.
I had a minor issue, I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry, Lucas.
Just to wrap up.
Also, yeah, please, if you can wrap up. Thank you.
So cities face many challenges, and we are not facing a world easier than today in 10 or 15 years. So 2030 is not ahead of us. It's somehow something of the past. We are not looking to a world that will be better in terms of infrastructure resiliency. How do we fund that? Maybe we need a guarantee fund for cities. Maybe we need a bank for cities. Maybe cities and local governments and urban areas, they will need better a better international financial system and architecture that works with them and for them. And for that, I think the G20 is very much strategic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucas. Very interesting inputs. So I would like to do a second round with the panelists, but I ask all the panelists if you can respond in 2 minutes to the question, because we are running a little bit late. I would like first to go back to Mara. And Mara, you explain what cities and regions have been doing with the support of the ministry on the localization of the SDGs. You also mentioned that regions develop 18 sustainable regional development strategy. Can you, given that one of our recommendations in the paper is to use the SDGs to shape and design new regional development policy and strategy, can you tell us in 2 minutes a bit more on how Italian regions and metropolitan areas have been using the SDGs to design these strategies?
Yes, of course, and thank you again very much for the interesting insights to reflect on in the near future. First of all, I would like to build on some of the issues raised by the other panelists. We are trying to, in Italy, we are trying to facilitate a process, a long learning and long viewing process, meaning that what we are thinking about is about using 2030 agenda and SDGs implementation as a way for modifying our policy making and for driving policies towards the achievement of sustainable development objectives, which means that regions and metropolitan cities, in defining their own strategies, which means they have a document, okay, but there is a process definition and caring in a long-term way, which is building trust internally to the administration. It is nurturing territorial committees for driving and orienting all the policies towards the SDGs, and also linking to budgeting and to economic documents at regional and metropolitan level to orient programming and to assess if and how budgeting has been helping the achievement of the SDGs. They are hugely working on vertical governance, which means that we are trying to promote a lot and to facilitate the collaboration between the regional level and the metropolitan and local level. And with the further agreements we are working on, we are hugely encouraging the further engagement of local entities, not only for developing local agendas, which is our way and sign of understanding if they are going in a way that where we can meet in a sense, but also in terms of engaging local entities into the process, which means networking also nationally and bringing and feeding the multi-level governance, but also, as already Shipra was saying, using VLRs and VNRs as checking points of this process. So they are able to emphasize and to bring political engagement to the whole process, which is the other way they are using our, and we all are using in our collaboration the process we are in. Just a last remark about networks. The other, one of your main findings, and it also recurred in the other interventions, one of the main elements is about strengthening territorial capacity in networking with other territories. This is another element we are working on with them. We are trying to bring them to different international networking, and we're doing that with the OECD also, and we want to thank you again for your collaboration, but we have to further work on that. Also in terms of capacity in dealing with funding, as Mauricio was saying, we have to increase the capacity of local entities to manage funding and to orient them to the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you very much. Let me go back to Shipra now. And one of the 3 policy areas that we identify as a gap in the policy as a big crisis is the one of the cost of living. And can you tell us what are your views in UN Habitat, and how the SDGs, how VLR could help to address the rising cost of living at the local level?
Thanks, Stefano. And I think, I mean, of course, we know, and your survey has confirmed that the cost of living crisis is is deepening. In fact, it's not under control. It's deepening due to a number of factors: drought, climate-related phenomena, ongoing conflicts, supply chains continue to be disrupted. And of course, people continue to, because of these factors, and generally move to urban areas. So the urban cost of living crisis is in fact also extremely important, not just in rural areas, but in urban areas. And the rising costs of, as you said, energy, the rising costs of housing, accessing services. Let me give you a few quick examples, as you said, 2 minutes or even less. One, we talk about SDG 11, making cities human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, etc. The first principle of investing in compact and well-planned cities with efficient mobility systems, accessible green spaces, access to housing, affordable housing. You can reduce transportation costs, you can reduce housing costs, you can improve access to amenities and enhance overall livability and mitigate the cost of living burden. Other linked SDGs, obviously, clean water, sanitation, affordable clean energies, SDG 7, resilient infrastructure, and investing in all of those is ultimately going to mitigate the cost of living. SDG 13 on climate action, we're talking about green jobs, we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about promoting sustainable practices, resilience, green economic opportunities, mitigating the financial impacts of climate change. I think that's another area that we really need to make those connections. SDG 4, education, equipping people with skills and the knowledge they need to grow in the new economy, livelihoods, decent jobs, and all of that. And I think all of these and many others show that by aligning strategies and actions with the SDGs, national governments, in partnership with local governments, can leverage the global agendas to address the root causes of the rising cost of living, reduce inequalities, and promote sustainable development. I will just conclude by saying there are 3 things that I want to flag here as key principles. One, also because you talked about food security in one of your final slides, and we work together on a number of these topics. One, focusing on smaller and intermediary cities, not just the big and large and metropolitan areas. Also what we did with G20 under the Italian presidency and the platform we have floated together with you, the G20 PLIC. Second, improving collaboration across urban and rural jurisdictions, not, the territorial approach that you call the territorial approach and we call the urban-rural linkages. And third, again, multi-level governance, strengthening the policy coherence between national, regional, and local, and aligning the interests, as Mauricio was saying, of finance, of communities, of local governments, and of the private sector. Those would be, to me, the defining principles for mitigating the cost of living crisis, keeping the SDGs as our overall North Star. Thanks.
Thank you, Shipra. Thank you very much. Indeed, the focus on intermediary cities is a key one. We started working for the G20, but we have many follow-up projects on that. Last question to Maurizio. There are many interesting questions in the Q&A, so I will do a final 1 minute tour for the panelists to address some of the questions in the Q&A. But now, Mauricio, will ask you that one of the key factors for the successful implementation of the SDGs at the local level, according to the survey, is political leadership. And given that you, in your previous life, you also were a mayor, can you tell us what is your view on the importance of political leadership for localizing the SDGs?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think the first thing we need to realize is the fact that mayors are political players. And yes, I can speak to that freely now because I am no longer a mayor. And as such, they look for political profitability in the things they do. I mean, that's reality, right? So I think that we really need to make the SDGs and the localization of the SDGs politically sexy, because that's the best way in which we can really engage mayors so as to having them to embrace the SDGs as a top priority. And for that, I think that we need to understand that mayors, particularly in cities in the developing world, have competing priorities. So in many of these cities, population lack access to water, to sanitation, to health, to education, to affordable housing. So the question is, in such a place, how can a mayor talk about the SDGs, which may sound as a very sophisticated type of language, when you at the same time have these very pressing basic needs? And for me, this is a communication exercise. It is about having mayors realizing that at the end of the day, SDGs is about improving people's lives in all regards. So when they stop talking about a sophisticated language, but rather take things back to basics and saying, hey, by addressing SDGs, what I am doing really is improving people's lives, I think that then this not only becomes a top priority in their agendas, but it also becomes politically sexy. And I think that international organizations can do a great job in supporting mayors in this communication exercise. I think another very important component to strengthen political leadership for the implementation of the SDGs in cities is how to engage communities in the co-creation of projects to implement SDGs. I think it's not only about inviting the community to participate. It is really about engaging the community in the co-creation of initiatives. And also realizing that at the end of the day, the SDGs should become a comprehensive urban planning tool. A comprehensive urban planning tool. Like Aziza mentioned, it is really a policy-making tool. When a mayor embraces the SDGs as an urban planning mechanism, then it is fostering political leadership for the implementation of this kind of policies. And at the end of the day, this is key because we know that SDGs will be realized in cities and in regions.
Thank you, Maurizio. Thank you very much. So we have really many interesting questions on the chat, and I would like to ask at least one of them to each of you. I think the first one can really go to Maurizio again, because it's about the guarantee for city to borrow internationally. We have questions asking if will require a lot of careful thinking, of course, through the Green City Development Bank. Seems like a good idea. Is there any traction for this idea, Maurizio? From the preliminary discussion, do you think there is traction for this idea of the city borrowing internationally? So if you can respond in 1 minute on that, then I will go to Shipra and Mara for the last question.
Yes, I think there's a lot of interest. I think there's a general understanding that we need to do something to increase cities' access to SDG finance. And we think that these kind of specific mechanisms could become, as I said before, game changers. The Green Cities Guarantees Fund can actually become a stepping stone towards eventually setting up a Green Cities Development Bank. And again, just the fact of having a guarantees facility would improve cities' access to finance in a great way, because again, it will become another source of guarantees for them in order to circumvent the often highly politicized sovereign guarantees that in many cases they have as their only option. So providing a different option would be very relevant in my view. But again, we can keep building on that, because for me, it is about creating a new institutional framework for cities' access to finance, in which the Green Cities Guarantees Fund is a piece, but probably a Green Cities Guarantees Bank is another, of course, greater piece. And then you have, of course, the issue of access to private investment, which is in itself huge, because unfortunately, there's a lack of understanding currently between the private sector and city officials. Why? Because for the most part, the private sector has been used to deal with national governments, not local governments. We need to create spaces for mutual understanding and to co-create projects in which there would be appetite for private investment into cities.
Thank you, Maurizio. Thank you very much. So we had a technical issue with Lucas from Rio de Janeiro, so we'll try to see if he can be back or not. I think you just touched on the role of the private sector, which was one of the questions from the Basque Country. So we'll merge the next two. And for Shipra, the first one is, do you see the SDGs as a tool for monitoring or also as a future foresight tool that can help map and facilitate interaction with decision makers, civil servant, and the broader community of stakeholders, including the private sector? And then the Basque government was asking what is the role of the private sector in the localization of the SDGs. So if you can address these two, Shipra, would be great.
Thanks very much. And absolutely, I think, you know, we've all agreed that the SDGs and the voluntary local reviews are not compliance instruments alone. They are for monitoring, but they're also for advocacy, for engagement, for evidence-based planning, policy making, for directing finance, and picking up on Maurizio's point that one, finance is not coming to cities, but also when it does come, is it going to the most impactful catalytic projects that are going to advance multiple SDGs at the same time? So this is where the role of the VLRs can come much more as a planning tool, as a foresight tool, as a directing finance tool, and as a tool to bring together whole of society and whole of government to advance the SDGs. And as what we're saying, make localization sexy, not just politically sexy, but sexy for the whole society and a North Star. But on the private sector, I do have to say here that I think we need to make the SDGs as the central piece of the ESG conversation. You know, for the longest time, the private sector has had a CSR conversation, they've had an ESG conversation, but honestly, we need to make the SDGs the central piece, the next generation piece on how the private sector addresses and approaches responsibility to larger global agendas, to justice agendas, to social inclusion agendas. And this is where we are not making a dent yet. We're not there. And I think we need that strategy, both at regional, local level, but at the global level, to be really able to make that dent. Thanks.
Thank you, Shipra. Let me ask the last question to Mara. I wanted to ask you this question about the European Union. I see that you already replied in the chat, but maybe it's good if you also want to elaborate a bit for all the participants. So the question is really how, if there is any research or analysis on what the EU is, if the EU is pushing for more implementation of the SDGs through the European Pillar of Social Rights, and if you think that local and regional authorities in the EU member states are more familiar with the European framework or with the global framework like the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. I don't know if Mara, you also want to mention your answer to all the participants.
Yes, for sure. Thank you very much. And yes, just quickly, what I was saying is about the work we are developing with the Department for Cohesion Policy in Italy, which involves the definition of an assessment model and the integration into the assessment plans for the cohesion policy at European level. We are talking about structural funds in Europe. The contribution of the cohesion policy with also reference to the social pillar to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Objective, National Sustainable Development Objectives, and the SDGs. This is an exercise that we are still developing and that we will bring to regions and metropolitan cities in the next months to calibrate and to shape with them the model and to make them work also at territorial level. So what we expect to have back is a picture about the use of cohesion policy in terms of contribution to the achievement of the SDGs. And this kind of exercise is a pilot for us because it has to open and pave the way towards the definition of models for all the other policy sectors and integrated policies we have at national and territorial level. So it's quite important to us. I would also like to pick up very quickly, two elements from Shipra's and Maurizio's answers. The first one is about the engagement of private sector. We are hugely working within a platform called National Forum for Sustainable Development, but we are lacking the real integration with the enterprises and particularly small and medium enterprises. So with what we are working on now is exactly what Shipra was mentioning. We have to align ESG exercises to the overall achievement of the SDGs. So this means sharing measures and indicators, and this is what our enterprise organizations are all asking to us. So we are working on this item also at territorial level with the regions. We are hugely working on the indicators and on the data elaboration and production. The second element I would like to raise very quickly is about the importance of not only align, but integrate policies and programming at regional level. So I'm talking about law requirements in terms of using of funds and programming elements into the overall frameworks of the SDGs and the territorial agendas for sustainable development. This can really be a key player in changing the way we use to move on policy making. And this is what we are trying to do with the implementation of the National Plan for Policy Coherence for Sustainable Development, integrating the localizing issue within the implementation of the program. Thank you very much, Stefano.
Thank you so much, Mara. There are still many questions in the Q&A, but I see that all the panelists are very active in responding to them. So let's, I will not reopen the floor because we are running a bit late. We are just on time for the final remarks from the Committee of Region representative. And we are really, really glad to have Ricardo Rio, who is the mayor of Braga from Portugal, and also the rapporteur on the SDGs from the Committee of Region. That has been our great partner. This is the third survey that we do together, this time also with SDSN, that allow us to expand our outreach. But we really would like to hear from you now, Mayor. What are your thoughts on this joint work, on the panel, and on the way forward? So, Mayor, you have the floor.
Oh, good afternoon. And thank you, Stefano, for your kind words. Actually, it's really a pleasure to see so many familiar faces on this topic in the list of panelists and also in the list of participants of this initiative. And it was really interesting to follow the interventions before. As you mentioned, the cooperation between the European Committee of the Regions and the OECD has always been what we call a win-win, so that we could support SDGs territorialization, and we very much value it at the core. Every 2 years already, we have been doing this service, which have been a real value added for policymaking. And actually, if we were not doing this service, there will just not be no data available on SDGs monitoring other than the one that is available at the national level. And I think that this work is key. And in many initiatives that we have been developing, it has been very useful, not only for us, cities and regions, but also for the European institutions, to whom we provide also frequently this information. With this data, EU decision makers realize we are the real deal, and that we can do a lot more with the right support, which can only happen if we develop what we call the place-based EU policies that we are continuously aiming for and calling for at the Committee of the Regions. This year, I think that we took our joint work to the next level with the collaboration with both the OECD and SDSN. And I must say, Guillaume, this opened many new doors also for the European Committee of the Regions. Actually, we used to work mostly on SDGs localization in the EU. And now, in addition, we also connect the dots with our work on decentralized cooperation and at the UN. Working a lot more with the international partners and non-EU regions and cities on SDGs localization outside EU borders. And actually, this is not only happening through the Committee of the Regions, we are also fostering this type of practices in the member cities, in the mayors. And I give you obviously the example of my city, Braga, which is working very strictly with the new SDSN Portugal, and we have been working already with OECD-SDSN so that we can structure a lab for the Portuguese-speaking countries to foster the use of the SDGs at the local and regional level. A key remark I would like to make is that this report is not the end of the story, it's the beginning, and that is the basis for good policy making and political decisions. And these conclusions that were presented highlighted that financing and capacity building are the main obstacles to SDGs localization. And this is why, at the Committee of the Regions, we will focus on both these topics this year. On financing, we will organize a dialogue between regions, cities, and EU institutions, such as the European Commission and the European Investment Bank. And this dialogue will focus on the EU financing for SDGs territorialization in the EU, we will discuss which funds are available, as well as the existing bottlenecks for regions and cities to access it on SDGs. In addition, we will also organize an EU-UN dialogue on SDGs localization. And both these events will be in June, and we obviously look forward for your participation. We also want to support capacity building and intend to support the Joint Research Center new project on the implementation of SDGs in regions to this end. As you can see, despite this year being an election year in the EU, which usually it's a whole year for many of these priorities, we still plan to do a lot of work on SDGs at the core level, but also as a mayor in my city and together with other partners in our countries, in Europe, and all over the world. And we should duly showcase it as we are doing right now through the presentation of this survey.